8 years of software support could be game-changing for the modern smartphone market, considering people are upgrading less and less. In fact, I have friends who won't upgrade their phone until they're either not supported anymore or they break, which is often why they lean more towards iPhone, because Apple has been really good about 5, 6, 7 years of software support. But Google has recently announced with the Pixel 8 and Pixel 8 Pro that they'll be supporting their devices for 8 years, from 2023 to 2030. And that's a big deal, but it could also be a very, very easy way to mess up the oldest phone in the supported lineup if they're not careful. And there is a perfect example from history of exactly that happening. And it happens to be an Apple product, specifically the iPhone 4S. And so today we're going to talk about the 2011 smartphone king turning into a 2015 crippled shell of what it used to be. So back in 2011, the iPhone 4S stood to be a refinement of the iPhone 4 because the iPhone 4 had already introduced some pretty impressive things. The brand new design with stainless steel and glass, the incredibly sharp Retina display for its time, and a front-facing camera. And when you look at the new iPhone 4S, well, new at the time, it's very clear that those key things were here to stay. We still have the Retina display, front-facing camera, and of course, this timeless design. In fact, the only thing that changed outside of the phone was the bands on the antennas, just so that Apple could avoid another antenna gate situation. The iPhone 4S also got white as a mainstay color, though I think the CDMA version of the iPhone 4 got white as well, but it was a mainstay for every carrier with the iPhone 4S. So unless you were really paying close attention to the antenna band placement of the iPhone 4 versus the 4S, there wasn't a big external change, but the big changes came internally. The two that stood out for me were the camera, going from 5 megapixels to 8 megapixels on the rear shooter, which meant that this was the first iPhone to shoot in 1080p video. And the biggest change, which was very impressive at the time of release but became sort of detrimental years later, was the new A5 chip. The A5 chip was only Apple's second in-house developed processor. The one before that was the A4, which I don't know why they called it 4, other than maybe because it was introduced with the iPhone 4, but it was also in the iPad 1, so I don't know. But either way, the A4 was the first of what we consider the modern Apple Silicon lineup, and the A5 was the second, and it was very powerful. I still remember when I got this iPhone 4S thinking how fast this processor was. It flew through iOS 5 like it was nothing. I love this phone, and at the time, it was the fastest and smoothest feeling phone, and sure, there were bigger options, and sure, there were cheaper options, but if you wanted what was considered the best iPhone at the time, and in my opinion, still the best iPhone introduced, yeah, you'd go with an iPhone 4S. I mean, I know that sounds a little biased, but I mean, it's such a classic design, and I know it's a timeless design because Apple's still using some derivative of it today. But the reason why I say that the A5 was incredible at its introduction, but a detriment only a few years later, was because within the next 2 years, we would go from the skeuomorphic design of iOS that Steve Jobs and Scott Forstall were very fond of, to a very flat design, courtesy of Johnny Ive. And with the new feature introductions that came with iOS 7, we would see the A5 pushed to and beyond its limits. Now, I don't think it's completely unreasonable to say that when a new iPhone comes out, the version of iOS that comes out with it was clearly optimized with that iPhone in mind first, and then they optimized it down for all the previous versions. But within 2 years of the iPhone 4S's introduction, the latest version of iOS essentially crippled the performance of what was originally an extremely smooth phone to use. And yes, I know there's conspiracy theories out there about how Apple deliberately slows their phones down, and they got an extra bone when it was found out that Apple was slowing the devices down when the batteries got old, but this is different. This is actually a piece of software going onto a phone that would have otherwise been completely fine, pushing so many features that were clearly intended for the latest generation of the iPhone that anything before it basically ground to a halt. And keep in mind, this is only 3 years into the iPhone 4S's life. We went from iOS 5 at launch to iOS 6 and now iOS 7. And I personally remember when I downloaded iOS 7 onto my 4S that it felt like the phone had been slowed down with a parachute. But as the year went on with iOS 7, there were some optimizations made and the phone got a little better and we did see some improvements to the general performance. Then the next year happened and iOS 8 hit, introducing even more features that the phone could technically do, but were clearly intended for, at that point, the latest introduced iPhone 6. And this was around the time that Apple was really getting into their stride with performance bumps on the new processors. We had just seen the 64-bit chip introduced in the iPhone 5S. Now we're seeing dual cores and higher frequencies in the 6, And then we get to iOS 9 and the introduction of the iPhone 6s. So on the plus side, that's 5 years of software support, which is right on par with the average for the iPhone. The most we've ever seen is the iPhone 6s getting upwards of 7 years of software support. But hey, the iPhone 4S, that thing got 5 years of software support. And the last version of iOS that it was left with ruined it. The upgraded notification shade, the new control center, multitasking being now a major player in the software as opposed to just being an afterthought that Steve Jobs put in because people kept begging him to do it. All of these things began to really tax this device, and with only 512 megabytes of RAM, this was just not a phone that was ever intended for any level of multitasking or background tasks, or really anything that was introduced after iOS 6. And that's unfortunate because this phone had so much potential and was crippled by the fact that the features introduced on preceding software was meant for the preceding phone, and then just brought to this device because they had to. I mean, don't get me wrong, people would have been furious if Apple's best designed smartphone, and in my opinion, the best smartphone they've ever made, was capped off at 2 years of software support just so that it could keep running iOS 6 with the skeuomorphic design. People would have been furious, but to run it for 5 years and essentially making it worse every single year to the point that the last piece of software it ever ran made it borderline useless was also completely unacceptable. In fact, going back to this phone and using it with iOS 9 has made me want to try and downgrade this back to iOS 5 or even iOS 6 just so that I can have that old experience and remember the phone how I want to remember it, which was a fast, fun, just beautiful skeuomorphic device. But now with all of that in mind, you're probably asking, what does this have to do with the modern smartphone, the newest iPhones, the Google Pixel 8 and 8 Pro? What does this have to do with it? Well, I'm so glad you asked. See, like I said, every time a new version of the iPhone or even the new version of the Pixel comes out, the software that comes out with it is clearly made with that device in mind first, and then it's optimized to run on the predecessors of that device, whether it be the Pixel 7 or the iPhone 14, whatever. With 8 years of software support potentially on the horizon for the new Google Pixel, that means that in 8 years, we're going to go from the 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. That is 8 different phones, and that means that the oldest one, the Google Pixel 8, will have to have the software of the 15 shaved down and optimized for that piece of equipment. And if it's not done well, you run the risk of making that device into the next iPhone 4S and leaving it with a terrible taste in most users' mouths because they came to buy an incredible piece of hardware that was crippled by the end of its life. Apple's been pretty good about this, and while it does piss off some users that new features get shaved off of the iOS that comes to their 1, 2, or 3-year-old device, it does mean that this device can run that software at a reasonable speed without worrying about their phone feeling too drastically slowed down with the latest software. And I'm hoping that Google does something similar. But with that incredibly far-reaching 8-year software support announcement, I just couldn't help but think back to my iPhone 4S and how bad it felt to be left with a very slow device after only 5 years of support. Of course, when it comes to technology, I tend to be a bit more of a history buff, as you can tell, but it just was something that was really apparent to me when they did it. So hopefully I'm wrong, or hopefully they do what I said and optimize it down to work with the oldest software all the way to the newest. But until 2030, we're not going to know. I hope I'm right, and I hope Google does what I said, but time will tell. Either way, that's been it. Thank you all so much for sitting through this weird history lesson / talk about software support on new phones. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, a like would definitely be appreciated, and if you want to make sure that you don't miss other content like this, go ahead and subscribe. I do stuff like this all the time. I got another video coming up that may or may not be accepted super well by certain fan bases, but we'll see. And aside from that, thanks again for watching. I hope to see you in the next video. Make sure to be there and have a good one.